All right. Good morning, everybody. And there's a replay going on there, Andy. All right. Good morning, everybody. And there's a replay. Oh, I'm sorry there, buddy. That's my fault. Oh gosh. Oh, John is bad. Gosh, we are learning stuff right and left this morning here at McDuff Studios on Mystery Island. It's been a learning experience, and the big thing is that I didn't ever think that daylight savings time was going to have an effect on my guest over there in Germany, Harley Schlanger. But of course, nobody called up Germany and said, "Hey, by the way, America is changing the time on the East Coast." So that explains why we are starting late this morning, and it's all my fault, and I apologize. And next time the time changes, we will tell all our foreign overseas guests in advance like we should have. So anyway, we are back on, and it's so nice to have Harley with us. And thanks for joining us on very short notice this morning, Harley Schlanger.
Well, it's my fault, John. I usually pay attention to these things, and for some reason today it skipped my mind that we shift to daylight savings time next week. Although the EU keeps saying they're going to pass a new rule to get rid of daylight savings time, so maybe next year we won't have to do this.
Okay, that would be wonderful. Wouldn't I love it? I mean, we always complain, and it doesn't make any sense anymore. All right, never mind about that. Thanks for being with us. And where should we start this morning, Harley?
Well, I just want to bring up a historical note, which is today is March 23rd, and 38 years ago, Ronald Reagan shocked the world in a televised address when at the last part of his address, he announced his support for what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I have a couple quotes from him, which are really quite amazing, especially for people who think Reagan was a warmonger. He said that the vision, we're going to present a vision of the future which offers hope, a program to counter Soviet missile threat with measures which are defensive. He said, let us turn to the very strengths and technology which spawned our great industrial base to put an end to the threat of nuclear annihilation. He said, we have a new plan to intercept missiles, no longer dependent on massive retaliation. And he said he's calling on scientists to give us the means of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. And this was an attempt to reverse the illogic of the Henry Kissinger, Dr. Strangelove mutual and assured destruction approach, which had been and still really remains as the deterrent for nuclear weapons. Now, one of the reasons this is so significant for me and the Larouche Organization is that Lyndon LaRouche had been brought in by Reagan into the National Security Council to negotiate with the Soviets to see if they would accept a cooperative effort to bring in these new relativistic beam weapon systems that could be shared by both sides. And LaRouche was engaged in a several-month negotiation process with the Russians, the Soviets, and finally they said, no, they're not going to do it because they're lagging behind us technologically. And we would get too much of a benefit if they went with this over them. And they didn't trust that the US would not take advantage of that. Now, why is this so important? Why do I bring it up now? Well, because if you look at what happened last weekend with the last week with the Quad meetings, the so-called meetings of the Quadrilateral Strategic Group, which includes Japan, India, and Australia, and the United States, as a counter to China, an Asian NATO, so to speak. The rather testy initial confrontation between Blinken and Sullivan from the United States and the Chinese foreign ministry officials, Biden saying that he considers Putin a killer. Well, we're still in a very touchy, dangerous strategic situation where we still have huge numbers of missiles pointed at each other. We still have contentions. We're not talking. We're not engaging in a dialogue. We thought that was opened up by John Kennedy in 1962 and 63. And yet here we are today, all these years later. and we're still staring each other down with nuclear weapons and threatening to build new ones. So I think it's useful to reflect back. When Reagan was considered the big war hawk, the guy peace through strength, but the emphasis on strength. Well, no, his emphasis was on peace. He wanted peace, but he thought if you had strength and cooperation, you could have peace. And so I just wanted to bring that up because this is a historic day. One funny note, I believe you had Paul Gallagher on recently, didn't you, John?
Yeah.
The day after Reagan made this announcement, the news media had no one who could talk about it. So they brought Paul Gallagher on from our organization. At the time, we had something called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And Paul was on, I think, Good Morning America to explain what the Strategic Defense Initiative was all about. And another one of my associates was on another one of the morning talk shows. So we were very much at the center of that. Now, here's the funny thing. Reagan was working with Judge Clark, who was the National Security Council or his National Security Advisor. And that's who incorporated this at the end of his speech. Now, what happened then is that James Baker read the speech and took the last page out because Baker was an opponent, as was Henry Kissinger and others, of the idea of sharing technology with the Russians. At the last minute, just before Reagan sat down to give the speech, Judge Clark popped back up in front of him, handed him some index cards, and Reagan read from the index cards what was in his original speech, but was no longer on the teleprompter because Baker took it off. So that's just an interesting footnote to how close we came to not having that offer made to the Soviets.
That's amazing. I mean, just to think of that type of conflict, it's that close to the president. You have these two people that are pushing opposite agendas, and they play a game with the text of a speech the president's going to make by basically pulling words out of it and then shoving them back in. And that's going on at the level of the White House of the most powerful nation in the world. And that was happening back then. And that to me is the biggest part of this story, that you had people that close to the presidency, to the nuclear football, if you will, that are able to manipulate things by just cutting and pasting at the last second. And that's not this unique example. This kind of thing is part of the way the United States runs, I guess.
Well, here's the other thing that's interesting about it. Lyndon LaRouche was considered by some people, the Democrats considered him a right-wing neo-Nazi. The Republicans considered him a Russian communist agent. And yet here he was working with Reagan, working with the Reagan administration to negotiate with the Soviets on one of the most important questions. That is, how do we escape the possibility of war by accident, a nuclear war? And of course, as soon as that speech was delivered, there was an onslaught against LaRouche. The next day, Henry Kissinger contacted William Webster and said, can't you do something about LaRouche? We hear there's East German funds going into his organization. Daniel Moynihan, the senator from New York, denounced LaRouche, but then he denounced Reagan for listening to LaRouche. And shortly after that, the Get LaRouche Task Force was formed, which ran a long frame-up operation from 83 until 88 when they brought him to trial. And who was assigned the task in Boston of running the anti-LaRouche task force? Robert Swan
Mueller III,
who became the special counsel in the Trump case. And what was the issue? Are we a back channel for Russia manipulating the president of the United States? So, the more things change, they say the more things they remain the same. Well, what remains the same is we have a deep state or a military industrial complex, which intends to have the US in strategic geopolitical confrontations for their own purposes, not for the good of the nation, not for our national security or our defense, but for their purposes, including military expenditures, including the once they get out of government, going into the various companies of the military industrial complex and so on. So we still have the same problem that we had going back to the end of World War II, when there was a fight between the Roosevelt loyalists who wanted to continue some kind of alliance with the Soviets, and the other side, which was the British side, which said, no, an iron curtain is descending on Europe and we have to have a long war. Now, here's another connection. It was in 1946 that George Kennan wrote the Long Telegram, which advocated a strategy of containment of the Soviet Union, which became the basis of NATO, the deployment of nuclear weapons to Europe, and so on. Today, coming from the Atlantic Council, which is one of the leading agencies in promoting confrontation and defense spending, they just produced a few months ago something called the Longer Telegram, which says now we must do this to contain China. And I was on a webcast last night from the Atlantic Council where Dan Sullivan, a Republican senator from Alaska, was quoting from the Longer Telegram saying, yes, it may mean a 50-year Cold War, but that's what it's going to take to contain China. Now, if you think about what the Cold War was about, we came close to hot war a few times, including around Cuba in the early 60s. But what we found out when the Soviet Union collapsed and we got a chance to look at the archives, they were a hollow shell. They weren't going to be able to confront us, and probably most of them had no intention of doing that. So are we about to do the same thing now vis-a-vis China, when we have so much that we have to do to rebuild our own nation? And in fact, we probably could do it in collaboration with China and other countries.
I think that's one of the great psychological warfare achievements of the people that we call the deep state, and that is beginning after World War II. Instead of being a nation that takes care of its own and does like the four freedoms or the Social Security or the whole idea of we're going to take care of our poor and disabled, and we're going to look after our old people, and we're going to look after Americans. The entire shift of everything from the media to the military to everything you heard from diplomats and in the whole Cold War, all of that was accompanied by a shift in our foreign policy to what you call what do they call it? A liberation. Almost like our policy is now no longer look out for our own people. Our policy now is essentially regime change in the name of quote unquote democracy, which is the biggest lie that I can think of, because we never have imposed democracy anywhere.
John, supposedly we're doing it because anti-democratic forces are targeting us. But if you look at the effects of the war on terror, it wasn't Iraq that was targeting us. It wasn't Gaddafi that was targeting us. It wasn't Ukraine, the Yanukovych regime, that was targeting us. What we did is we knocked out regimes that wouldn't go along with this idea of a rules-based order. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of people have to think about, because I know there are a lot of people who don't trust China. There's still people who don't trust Russia. People who think Venezuela is going to send Russian nukes into South Texas or something, or the Cubans are still an existential threat to us. None of these are real, but they're still there as boogeymen, and they're used from time to time with false flags and other things. I mean, there's a whole new report coming out from Aaron Mate and the Gray Zone on the whole question of the OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that they suppressed the reports of the actual investigators who were on the ground in Douma, Syria, who said there were no chemical weapons used. And what was there was not deployed by Assad's forces, but was deployed by the so-called moderate rebels that we were supporting. And yet we still have this narrative that Assad was gassing his own people. That's why we have to keep troops in Syria, and we're still spending money there. And we're trying to maintain a balance between Turkish Islamists and Iraqi, Iranian Sunni forces, and that it's a mess. And this is the same problem, that the geopolitical demands of the global oligarchy is to have continuous wars. So are we protected by having American troops in a part of Syria and Iraq? Are we protected by what's going on in Afghanistan? You know, I don't think so. And if you look at the bin Laden operation, that was facilitated by the United States that used bin Laden and created Islamic terrorists to bring down the Soviets when they went into Afghanistan. So virtually all of these so-called terror threats have some thumbprint somewhere from the CIA and the mercenary consulting forces that we're deploying. So how are we secured by this? And the same thing with, we saw it with Russiagate. I think there's an element of the China, China, China today, which is very similar to what we heard with Russia, Russia, Russia when President Trump was first elected. The image you get of an authoritarian China trampling on everyone's rights is very different from what you see if you actually go to China. And if you talk to people who spend time there and talk to the Chinese people, they're very proud that their regime has had a serious war on poverty inside China. 800 million people were lifted out of poverty in 2 decades. What are we doing now? You know, we're putting more and more of the middle class into poverty in this country. So, you know, I think this is where you see the power of the financial oligarchy and their media and their political operations to manipulate for their own purposes.
Well, let me just kind of try to lend a little voice to some of the folks that are, because we've been talking about China with a number of the folks from Schiller Institute and Larouche Organization over the past 3 weeks, and most people that comment on it are like really skeptical about the idea that they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, you know, it's like you almost have to show them the houses and the 2-car garages and the you know, well-behaved, clean kids walking around. Is there some way that you can, you know, underscore or undergird this, trestle under this idea that, yes, that sounds good. You know, it sounds good. But on the other hand, we have had so many times where propaganda is the only thing you ever hear about China. So there's a kind of still of a big disconnect here with a lot of, at least a lot of my subscribers, and the idea that the Schiller and the LaRouche organization are putting forward, to the extent that, hey, China is taking care of its own. China is making a lot of progress, and we should actually go there and visit and look at it. I just give you that feedback because I think that's something that needs to be confronted.
Well, let me just approach it from a couple of standpoints. One of the more interesting things I saw recently was Bill Maher, whose cynicism is almost too much for me to take. But he did a little thing on the difference between China and the United States. And he showed footage of Chinese cities, of Chinese schools, of the children learning, of the infrastructure they have there. And you can find that anywhere. China has, I mean, President Trump, when he came back from China, said he was totally impressed with the Chinese infrastructure. And he used that as a way to say, we've got to push this here. Biden made the statement the other day, the Chinese are eating our lunch when it comes to infrastructure. Now, the figures on lifting people out of poverty. Now, when we talk about a middle class in China, we're not talking about what used to be considered an American middle class standard of living. They started with a very low bar. I mean, very dirt poor villages, the majority of the population living, you know, what they call the iron rice bowl. But now what you see is they've lifted 800 million people. And these are not China's figures only. These are all kinds of international agencies. And the French government did a report on this recently. The Italian, Michele Gerasi, who was in the last government of Italy, who spent 10 years teaching in China, said over the course of 10 years, he saw incredible improvements in the standard of living. Now, here's the thing that people have to realize. China didn't advance by attacking the United States or attacking any other country. China's initial improvement economically was the result of what I would say was a very stupid approach to the American economy of outsourcing our industry, of giving our corporations tax credits to go to China to take advantage of cheap labor. And so large numbers of American corporations relocated their industrial plants, their supply centers to China, extending our supply chains so that we became dependent on China for things from pharmaceuticals to computers to various other things. And the Chinese initially were working for very low wages, which is why the corporations went there. This was called free trade. This was the World Trade Organization policy. And it was not only cheap labor, but they had no environmental restrictions. They had no regulations for the grade of toilet paper that was used in the bathrooms in the Chinese factories. So it's cheap. And those goods were then shipped to the United States through Walmart and other companies who sold them to Americans whose income had dropped because they lost their industrial jobs because they got shipped to China. That was not done by the Chinese. That was done by American corporations, global corporations. Now, at a certain point, the Chinese started learning. Some of it may have been intellectual property theft. Some of it was just studying the industrial processes. China has more PhD students in physics by far than we do. In fact, if you go to many American universities, what do you find? The people studying plasma physics and advanced energy systems, they're all from Asia, not just China, but from Asia. Valedictorians in West Coast high schools, many of them are from China, Vietnam, and so on, while Americans are majoring in sports medicine and being a sports agent. So we've shifted our approach from physical economy to consumerism, to a credit economy. And you get rich through speculation. In China, they're still building, they're still producing. And their idea is to leap over the existing technology into artificial intelligence and high-speed rail, space exploration, nuclear fusion, and so on. So the so-called drop of America compared to the rise of China was not something China did except trying to improve their circumstances. It's something that was done to us by our politicians that were supported by the globalists who wanted to get cheaper labor, cheaper costs to make larger profits. And at a certain point, the Chinese said, okay, now we're going to upgrade our labor situation. We're going to pay better wages. We're going to improve the environment. So when the costs went up, a lot of the US companies had to look elsewhere, and they went to other countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam. But what we see in China is a mixed situation. They don't have a democratic Western freedom. That's definitely true. But the argument that they're carrying out concentration camp policies against the Uyghurs, that comes from one report by one professor who used pictures which actually showed a Chinese prison camp, not a Uyghur labor camp, but a place where common criminals were marching in striped uniforms, similar to what you could find in almost any US state. And that was passed off as a concentration camp for the Uyghurs. We just had a conference where we had a Pakistani Muslim who went to Xinjiang province to investigate, are the Muslims in Xinjiang province being persecuted? And he came back and he said, the standard of living of the Muslim population in Xinjiang province has increased by 60% in the last 10 years. The number of jobs have gone up. The number of people who are educated has gone up. Now, did the Chinese imprison some of the Uyghurs? Yeah, because they were Islamic terrorists who were recruited, who fought in Iraq, who fought in Syria. You have an Islamic population there that was being recruited in the mosques. So they shut down some mosques. Well, we did the same thing here. They arrested some of the radical clerics who were recruiting people to be terrorists, the same way we did here. So why is it acceptable for us, or in Syria or Iraq, for us to go in and level a town where the Islamic terrorists are, and for the Chinese instead to try and take the younger people out of the environment where they're being recruited to being terrorists? So I'm not saying it's perfect, it's a wonderful place. I'm saying you have to realize that there's a propaganda arm of the US military-industrial complex which needs to have an enemy. Look how much we heard about how Russia rigged the 2016 election. how corrupt Trump was, how corrupt the Republicans were working with the Russians. Was any of it true? No. Now we're hearing the same thing about China. Just one other example, Hong Kong. Hong Kong is by treaty part of China. It's not an independent country. Hong Kong, for over a century and a half, was under British rule. It was a colony of the British. And Hong Kong had incredible poverty. You had these banks that were the British banks that were laundering drug money through Hong Kong, but there was very little industry. Recently, you've seen an improvement of that situation. So, it's as though in Puerto Rico, the United States had extradition rules for Puerto Ricans who were engaged in trying to overthrow the government. Well, that wouldn't be illegal. That's all the Chinese are trying to do. So here's the final point on this, John. It's essential that we have a dialogue, that we recognize that we have different systems, but that doesn't mean our system is better than theirs. We talk about China trying to use their muscle to impose their will on other countries. How many countries has China invaded? How many nations have they done what we did to Iraq, what we did to Libya? How many nations has China done that to? They haven't. So when we go around with our rules-based order rhetoric, we have to take a better look at what our deep state has done on behalf of the economic hitmen of the International Monetary Fund, Wall Street, and the City of London. That's what we're saying. And be fair and objective about it. Don't just jump to conclusions.
Well said, and I take your points very, very seriously, and I want to let that go, but I want to say one more thing about this situation, and that is about the Chinese students that are everywhere and excelling in all of the physical sciences and math and everything. The general perception is that they're way ahead of us technologically already, but that does not benefit us, because these people are not really free agents that are going to go out and do great things for humanity. They are all sent here by this central government of China. And when they go back to China, they're going to be doing what the Chinese government wants and not necessarily something good for humanity, which basically is a long shadow cast by Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution and all the horrors that are still resonant in many people's minds. So this idea that these guys are here and we should be happy and women are here and we should be happy because they're advancing science generally is good for the good of mankind is kind of hard to sell.
Well, you made an important point there. The China of Mao was a horrible place. The Communist Party, which made a revolution in 1949, and then the so-called Cultural Revolution, attacked Western standards. If you played the violin, played Beethoven, you could go to jail, or they'd break your hands. I mean, the Maoist regime was a horrible regime. Now, this is not the Maoist regime. And in fact, they're bringing in Beethoven to their schools as we're ending funding of orchestras in high schools in the United States. The Chinese have last year 250,000 pianos were sold, as one of the things parents are doing is wanting their children to learn how to play the piano, to play Bach and Mozart, Western music. And you can begin to see the influence of that on traditional Chinese music. Now, when you say, what's the benefit of having Chinese students here? Well, what's the benefit of having students from anywhere in the world here? On the one hand, you're giving them, at least it used to be, a better education. And in terms of the sciences, I think they realize the American universities are still the best. Unfortunately, Americans aren't taking advantage of it. American students are not going into physics or advanced engineering. Secondly, many of these Chinese students, or some of them, stay here and become outstanding researchers at MIT, at Harvard, at Johns Hopkins, who do become Americans. Are we to assume that anyone who's Chinese, who's in the United States, is an agent of the Communist Party? And some of the prejudices against the Chinese and their their excellence, their commitment to excellence among their youth, they used to make the same attacks on the Jews, the Eastern European Jews who came into cities like Newark, where my father grew up. And the valedictorians were Jewish, and there was a hostility against that. Are these really Russian agents? Why do we have these Jews here taking up the spots at the universities? So there's a tradition of intolerance. Now, what do we see with China? What are they actually doing? If you look at some of what they're doing in Africa, and if you talk to people in Kenya or Ethiopia or Eritrea or Tanzania, you'll find that they're not just building railroads, they're training people from those countries to become engineers and to work in factories that will enable them to develop a steel industry, develop small modular nuclear reactors that can provide electricity where they have none. So, should we be suspicious of anything they do that's good? Here's an interesting question. In Europe, where I am, we just had the whole AstraZeneca flap. So Germany hardly anyone has been vaccinated in Germany so far.
Oh.
So the Russians are providing their Sputnik V vaccine in Serbia, in Bulgaria, in Poland. The French and the Italians are asking for it, but the European Union is saying, no, we're not going to do it. This is vaccine diplomacy. They're trying to use this to get over on us. Now, if you have that kind of cynical view that a scientific advance, whether it's a Russian vaccine or the Chinese developing nuclear fusion, that this is not acceptable to happen because it puts them ahead of us, then who's suppressing scientific inquiry? That means we're suppressing the freedom of people to look into these things. And I think that's wrong. And I think the fact that the FBI has been watching out for Chinese professors, Chinese students, assuming every one of them is a communist agent, I think that's an attack on the idea of freedom that we cherish. If we find someone's doing bad stuff, then fine, deport them or arrest them. But I think the vast majority of young people in China are serious about improving their country, the same way the vast majority of young people in America were coming out of World War II. When we alleviated poverty, we built up the South completely. Made 100 years after the Civil War, we finally developed the South in the 50s and 60s. So think how much pride there was in southern states that began to improve their economy when they first started having shopping centers. So this is a natural tendency. The fact that their system is different, well, we know that. We're not asking, the Schiller Institute isn't saying the US should adopt the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, but where they're doing something right, that is government investment in physical production, as opposed to bailing out speculators and bankrupt banks, I would choose what the Chinese did after 2008 to what we did. They put speculators in prison. We rewarded them with bailouts, and we put people out of their homes who were victims of the speculators. That's what happened in the United States after 2008. So I think people have to get a perspective from up above rather than just reading the lies that are coming out in the mainstream media.
It's a huge uphill battle for folks like yourself, and I'm with you. I really do want, but at the same time, it's still so hard for people to believe. There's just so much baggage from China, propaganda, real or unreal. It's there. It is baggage we carry with us. For instance, with regard to the development programs that the Chinese are doing in Africa that you mentioned, my first reaction is, well, that's scary. We don't want China to be in Africa. I mean, that's closer to us, and they could put their nuclear missiles there, and then probably they're entwining the financial things just like we do with the IMF. They probably got their own, Chinese IMF to suck all the resources out and pay the people a pittance. And so why should we believe in their program when we can't even believe in our own? Just a lot of skepticism, Harley.
Well, being skeptical is okay, but ignoring facts is not okay. The Chinese have, when they've extended credit to countries and the countries can't pay, the Chinese renegotiate, give them better terms. That's what's happened in almost, I think, 3 or 4 of the countries that did run into trouble. Now, the difference is that we impose conditionalities through the International Monetary Fund and cut off the credit. So the projects don't get built. When the Western banks do it, the projects don't get built. The Chinese insist on finishing the projects because they know that that will generate more wealth in the country than if you're just extracting wealth. So there is a big difference. And this is something about 6 months ago, there was this whole story about the debt trap. That China's indebting these countries and going to use that to set up military bases and steal the resources. In the last 6 months, there have been reports from McKinsey and Associates, from Western consulting firms, who are saying that's not true. The Chinese are not doing that. And these are not firms controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. These are American capitalist firms who are now putting out reports showing the difference between what China is doing in Africa and what the Western countries historically did. And this goes back to another point you and I have discussed before. If you look at what John Kennedy was talking about in the late 50s, he was a vehement opponent of the colonial policy of the European powers and the United States toward Africa. And he was talking about debt relief. He was talking about credits, extending credits to help African countries develop technology. We have adopted a policy, and by we, I mean the City of London and Wall Street, which is technically called technological apartheid, that if governments don't go along with what we want, we'll do everything to stop their development, including sanctions. Look at what we're doing to Iran now. We're starving a nation. We're starving Syrians now. For what reason? Because they don't go along with our so-called rules-based order. So I think, it's really essential that people study the history of these things. Look at what the International Monetary Fund has done as an agency to suppress development. And now especially you look at the fact that you have the World Food Organization talking about maybe 200 million people facing starvation in the coming months because of a combination of drought, locusts, and wars and credit cutoff. It's horrible. And yet we don't cut back loans from the banks that are technically bankrupt. Why is it better for us to give zero interest credit to banks to buy and sell worthless financial instruments and cut off money to countries that are trying to buy food for their people just because they don't go along with us? So I think there's a lot that people can learn if they actually study. Don't take my word for it. Dig into it. Take a look at some of these things. There are reports out there that go into these hypocrisies that characterize Western policy. And the reason to do it now is that so many people who are supporters of Donald Trump learned that the mainstream media lied repeatedly, not just about Trump, but about Russia, about Putin. And they're still doing it. The Navalny affair. As the US media reported that Navalny had his top fundraiser going to the British embassy begging for money in 2013 to carry out regime change in Russia. That's not in the New York Times. That's not in the CNN. You look, why are we trying to shut down the pipeline to bring cheap natural gas from Russia into Western Europe? Has Russia ever reneged on an agreement to provide energy to a European country? Never. Do the Russians put sanctions against them? No. So why are we trying to shut that down? Well, because the people in the government are trying to get US natural gas sales to Europe, which will be more expensive. So, this is where you see the one hand washing the other in this corporate greed and control over our politics.
It really is a sad thing to see, and it's just getting worse unless people do, get up, stand up for your rights and be a citizen, not a subject. We have to have a sense of responsibility to open our minds. As Bob
See,
Marley's song says, only ourselves can, none but ourselves can free our minds. And if you're going around with a Mao Zedong, imported vision of China in your head, maybe it's time to reopen the situation and re-examine it, as Harley's been. And I think all of your folks are basically saying the same thing, is that, please, stop listening to the media version, the Time Life books version of reality. It doesn't exist. It was never real, and it's not real now. But we have to free our minds from the prejudices that have been imposed upon us by this incredibly successful propaganda campaign that's been going on since the end of World War II to try to turn a sovereign nation that respects itself, the United States, into the agent of an empire, an empire that's seeking to just do nothing but take more and take more and take more until eventually it has everything. That is the difference. Are we going to respect the sovereignty of other nations and make progress as our own nation? Or are we going to be a tool of financial interests behind the scenes that are going to be using us and our lives and our treasure and our prosperity taken away in order to simply continue speculating, continue playing the big game and making money hand over fist, as long as you don't get murdered in the process. It's like a bunch of mafias running against each other, and instead of sovereign states anymore. Okay, I'm starting to get on a soapbox. I better step off.
Well, John, let me just make one final point on this. If you think back to what I said at the beginning of the program about what Reagan did 38 years ago, how many people know that Reagan actually said he was willing to share the technology of anti-missile defense systems, beam weapon systems, electron beam, proton beam, electric magnetic pulse systems, not just anti-missile missiles, but advanced technology, that he was prepared to share that with the Soviets to put an end to the Kissinger doctrine of mutual and assured destruction. That's a different image of Ronald Reagan. And that's the image of, or the reality of Reagan that Larouche appealed to. And none other than Roger Stone told me that when he asked Reagan once, when Roger was working for Reagan in the 1980 campaign, and we were all over New Hampshire. Larouche had a very big campaign presence in New Hampshire, and he actually had a couple of meetings with Reagan while he was there. Roger asked him, "What do you think of Larouche?" And Reagan said, "Well, I may not agree with him on everything, but I agree with him on a lot of things." Now, if people think to the image they have of Ronald Reagan as a gunslinger, this is a media creation. But remember, Reagan sat down with Gorbachev. Reagan was prepared to get a global arms agreement with the Russians, which was somewhat limited. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, George H.W. Bush pressed the advantage of the West. The victors determine the rules. And since the late 80s, early 90s, we've had a gang of unilateralists, neoconservatives in both parties dictating the policies. So to think that Reagan was someone who was actually open to the idea of a détente policy, that's real history. That's written out of the history books. Most people don't know that. We know it because Larouche was there and was deployed by Reagan to carry out a task. Now, one other quick note. We just had a conference this weekend, the Schiller Institute, where we had speakers. We had the Chinese consul from New York City addressed it. The number 2 man at the Russian embassy at the UN. We had an advisor to the Syrian presidency speak. We had parliamentarians from Iraq, from Yemen, from France, from I can't remember. We had Dr. William Happer, who for a period of time was on the National Security Council, one of the leading experts on why carbon dioxide is not a threat to the environment. It was a fairly astounding conference, 2 days, where people got together and just talked. What could we do to collaborate, to take on the challenges we have, the security challenges, the economic challenges, the pandemic, and so on? And this is the kind of thing that the Schiller Institute does. And I would encourage people, if you're skeptical about what I'm saying, just take a look at who we're talking to and the kind of discussion we're having. You can see it was called, what was it called? The World at a Crossroad, 2 months into the new administration. And it's on the schillerinstitute.com. You can watch it, it's free. You can agree or disagree, but the fact is, we had a conference that no one else in the world could pull together like this. And this is one of the few advantages of having an online capability where you don't have to get people all in the same room.
Well, I watched a number of
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Sorry about that. I watched a number of excerpts of it, and it is marvelous. And congratulations on that to Schiller Institute and all the good people that presented there. And Harley Schlanger, thank you for your service. I mean, I think we say that to military people, but I think we need to say it to people who have careers in public service in your way, that is trying to preserve the peace, trying to assist humanity in being human and defeating these deep state imperial forces that are trying desperately to control us, enslave us, and in whatever you want to say, it's there's a lot of bad stuff out there, and you've been fighting it for a very long time. So congratulations on your work, and thank you, and we'll look forward to talking again.
Well, and thank you for that comment, John. And let me just tell people, if people want to challenge what I'm saying, if you want to be in a dialogue with me, come at me. You can write to me at harleysch@gmail.com. That's my personal email address. And if you're interested in what we're saying, I'll send you a link to our blog, to my blog page. So Harley, HARLEYSCH@gmail.com. Debate, dialogue, discussion, that's the way we have to go. The idea that we can somehow threaten countries and coerce them, we're accusing the Chinese of doing that. Why would we do that? So I think that's an important point. I'm happy to end with that.
All right, you guys, get in touch with Harley. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you again soon. Good night. Good afternoon.